All right, we're here. Thank you for having me on TenTalk. I'm pretty excited about this. I've never been interviewed on a podcast before.
Well, I've never run a podcast before,
Well,
so
good. So we're both sort of newbies. I'm nervous. As I said before we started, I'm really, really nervous right now. I don't know why, but I am very nervous. So, but here we go.
all right.
What is the TenTalk thing? I'll let you explain it.
So I'm Quinn, and I'm interviewing Mr. O'Connor today on TenTalk. And TenTalk is this new podcast we're hoping to start for the Smoke Signal. And we're going to be talking to different teachers and different people about like issues or any questions we might have. Today I'm talking to Mr. O'Connor about how he kind of got into journalism and into English teaching out of high school, because I feel like a lot of us, especially juniors and seniors at the moment, are like, oh my goodness, college is one of our next big steps and we don't know what to major in. We're trying to
Big
figure that
step.
out. We're trying to figure out what jobs to get. So I was hoping we might be able to get an idea of what you did by talking to you today.
Sure. So, so I'm Mr. O'Connor. I teach English here, and I run the journalism program. And I advise a student newspaper where Quinn is one of our editors on the student newspaper. Yeah. So I'll let you get started, and I'll try to remember what I can about my experience. Oh, what I can say. I get it. This is a big transitional period for high school kids moving from high school to college. Very huge transition. So I know the excitement, but also the confusion that comes with it. So, all right, we only have 10 minutes.
Oh
All
no.
right, this is TenTalk. It's 11. That's kind of interesting. All ones. So we have until 21, and then it stops. So go ahead.
All right. So how did you know you wanted to work in journalism? Did you know that like coming out of high school already, or did you figure that out in college?
I didn't actually. When I was in high school, I was more interested, I guess, in writing poetry and stories. Now I wasn't really good in terms of being like a really great student in high school. I didn't pursue literature academically when I was in high school. It was like a more of a personal pursuit. My parents were going through a divorce, and there was a lot of sort of turmoil in my house. And I started to write. It was like right around that time I started to write for myself. I was sort of like writing in secret. I didn't even let my friends know because they also weren't very sort of Englishy. I always did pretty well in English class. That was the one class in high school I actually liked. I didn't like many other classes, and I liked English. And I started writing. You know, my father left, and he left a typewriter behind. He wasn't a writer. He was a cop, but he had this really cool electric typewriter. So I brought it down into the basement where I had my room, and I started writing little poems. And that's kind of like, so I was interested in like language. I was really interested in sort of dealing with some of my emotional stuff in high school and dealing it through writing. And I would write little stories and poems, and I started keeping a journal and stuff like that in high school. But journalism really wasn't on my radar, other than my mother always read the newspaper. She loved, it was always in my house. Newsday, I grew up on Long Island. She was always reading the newspaper. And my grandfather was around a lot, and he would sit at the kitchen table and always doing the crossword puzzle. So I grew up around newspapers. And I think that probably had an influence. My mother loved this writer called Jimmy Breslin. He was a writer out of Queens, New York. And he really wrote about people and everyday problems. And she would read the columns to me sometimes that she found to be really funny. So I think that was probably influential. But at my high school point, I really didn't know that I was going to really become.
So what did you go into college for? And did you go into college right after high school?
No, I had a really like bouncy story. So after high school, I went to college and then I left and I got a job. I got a job as a carpenter. I did construction. I worked in the World Trade Center. You know, before 9/11, I was in the New York City Carpenters Union. And then I worked as an apprentice carpenter for, I don't know, maybe like 4 years or so on Long Island, working alongside someone else, doing renovations and things like that. I considered going into the police academy because I come from a family of cops. That really didn't pan out. I went to night school. And it was really when I went to night school, I went to a state university on Long Island at night with other grownups. And I was young, you know, I was in my early 20s. And it was great. and I fell in love with school. And it didn't happen for me in high school for whatever reason. I think probably because there was a lot of chaos in my house. I wasn't able to really dig into the academic side of things or something. For whatever reason, I wasn't able to do it in high school. But when I went to night school, it was like quiet. There were people were there were curious. They were intellectually curious, and I just fell in love with learning. And again, I was studying criminal justice because I thought I would become a cop. And but on the side, I started to read literature, and I got really into, like, I started reading Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, some of the old works of literature. But then I learned about these poets called the Beat Poets: Jack Kerouac, Gregory Corso, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, and they were like really avant-garde, sort of subversive writers. And I fell in love with them. I fell deep, and from them I started. They were really into different types of philosophy, so I started pursuing that, reading about that. I would go to a Barnes and Noble and I would read the books and put little pieces of paper in the books because I wouldn't buy them. I'd read them, and then I'd go back and I'd open them up like as if it was a library because they had great books. And I fell in love with like Walt Whitman. He's like a poet from the 1800s. So I just fell in love with literature. So when I finished my associate's degree, I did really well. I graduated with honors with an associate's degree. I decided to go to UMass, and I got into their English program, studied journalism, studied English. I'm sorry. Loved it. It was fantastic. It was a great program at UMass for English. Small little program, and you really get to know your teachers. And at UMass has one of the best daily newspapers in colleges, and I started writing little pieces about the arts, about plays and stuff like that. So it's like, whoa, this is kind of cool, like this journalism thing. And I started reading like my college newspaper. It's called the Collegian, and I was reading some of the columns. And there was this one guy in particular, this one student, college student. He was funny. I would laugh out loud. He was such a good writer. I was like, holy crap! Like, how do you do that? This is cool stuff. I was still writing poetry. I was part of the lit magazine Jabberwocky at UMass, but I wasn't thinking about journalism until I started reading the Collegian, and then I was like, this is really cool. So that's how I started thinking about journalism some more. It was when I was in college.
That's cool. And while you were in college, did you take any internships or anything to get experience in like outside of it, or just mostly?
I didn't, and I definitely recommend it. Do it. What I did is, I think what I did right is I was always very curious, and I think as a journalist, if you're going into journalism, curiosity is really the most important skill. And I was always like curious about like not just writing, but about like carpentry. I've always been curious about like agriculture and gardening. I've been curious about nature. I've been curious about mechanics. When I was in college, I went to Spain. I traveled around Spain. I went to Portugal. So, and I was curious about people and like old stories. So I didn't do an internship, but I was always kind of asking questions, and I was always a question asker. I remember driving my father crazy because I would ask so many questions about things. So, I did pursue my curiosities when I was in college. But I didn't do any kind of like formal things. I recommend it, by the way. And I had a very sort of bumpy road, I think, or sort of not a straight path, but I definitely recommend doing it. I just did it.
Do you think, like you just mentioned like all these different experiences, did those help you to then start writing like in the real world, like getting to an actual journalism company?
It didn't help me get hired anywhere, but it helped me become a better journalist. If I think one thing, like I said, one thing that is required of journalists is that you're really curious about people and about issues. You're humble in the sense you don't think you have all the answers. And I think I have none of the answers. I always like feel like I'm very naive in life, even though I'm pretty experienced. I always have this sort of default, like I just don't know enough. Which is good and bad at sometimes, but it's helpful for journalists. So I so that's kind of like, what was the question again? I'm sorry, I'm moving a little quick in my own head.
It's all right. I just asked, like, after you had all these experiences, what helped
Yeah.
you start writing in like getting into an actual newspaper company?
Yeah, so it didn't help me get into a newspaper, but it did sort of all those experiences really sort of began, I think, making me a better writer. And what happened is after college, I was working at a farm store. It's just a part-time job in Amherst Farmer Supply, shout out, great people there. Loading farmers trucks with feed and stuff like that. And again, very good experience for journalism. I was getting to know farmers. And again, I grew up on Long Island in the suburbs, partially visiting family in Queens and stuff like that. I had no experience with agriculture. When I came up here, I remember driving through New England and seeing the little tubes running between trees for sap, for maple syrup. And I remember thinking that they were lines so like they would stop snowmobilers for driving through the woods. I had no idea about New England and farming or any of that. So when I worked at the farm supply store, I was working with farmers, and this whole style of sort of like of language, the way they talked to each other was different. What they talked about was different. The words they used was different. Their stories were different. And I was just fascinated. I knew like I wanted to tell stories about people, and not just fiction stories, like about them. I wanted to tell stories about Sam and about this truck driver that had the funniest jokes in the world. And he grew up driving trucks to farms, and he grew up on a farm. And I was like, that's like what I want to sort of focus on. I love that stuff. And later on, when I became a journalist, I covered farms for a while. I wrote a fantastic series of story about a pig farmer, the Romanowski brothers up in Deerfield. That was really just, I got to do it. But it didn't really get me hired, but I did start becoming a better writer. It was when I was working at the farm store, I came across a help wanted ad for a little newspaper in Holyoke called the Holyoke Sun, a small little newspaper. I started very small. I started at the very bottom. Like I didn't start at anywhere near New York Times or anything like that. That was actually a recommendation for somebody. He said, don't shoot for the stars right away. Just get used to it. Learn the profession. Started a little weekly newspaper. I moved into Holyoke, was making like nothing. I was living up on High Street in downtown Holyoke, a beautiful brick apartment across from the old San Juan Bakery. It was this great little bakery where I get hot bread, and I just right down the street from the news house that I was working at, right down the street from City Hall, which I covered, and I covered the police beat, and I just got hired at this little weekly newspaper because I could write pretty well. And that's how I really got started as a journalist. I learned like on the job. Yeah.
All right, so we're essentially out of time, but I just have one last question.
Yeah.
What is one recommendation you would give to students who are kind of struggling to figure out what they want to do and how to do it?
All right, so get other recommendations. Just don't listen to Mr. O'Connor, because I'm probably going to give a bad one. Your parents are going to be like, this guy. I recommend, really being curious and, learning different things. You're young. You have plenty of time. So if you're interested in theater, when you're in college, get involved and, do stage, like get involved in building the stages or something, or act, or if you've never done mechanics before, if like I've never fixed a car, that's not for me. But if you're interested, look into it. Learn how to fix a car. Learn how to do carpentry. Learn about astronomy. Learn about physics. Learn about philosophy. So I think I am a true supporter in a liberal education. And by liberal, I don't mean the political term. I mean in a free education. And I think in college especially, it's a time where you can really look into different sort of disciplines, ideas, occupations. And I think the more you do that, the better. I think you have more of an opportunity then to maybe choose something you're interested in. And while you're doing that, maybe do some sort of mindfulness meditation to deal with the anxiety of not knowing what you're going to do, because it's a very anxious time. So I respect the anxiety. It's tough, but you'll get through it, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, leaving high school and suddenly seeing the world and seeing all the possibilities is a cool thing.
All right, so that's all we have for today on TenTalk. Thank you for listening, and as Mr. O'Connor said, stay curious.
Thank you.